So, just as I thought I would be getting back to doing some videos on reviews...
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Yes, that's right, Games Workshop has done something else. So we've been hit by this, which is their 2024 pricing update. Now, update is basically the word that you use when you want to sprinkle glitter onto increase. Because guess what? Prices are going up. Now, they do tell us that they are keeping the prices of the paints and the books the same, but basically every miniature is going up between 3 and 5%. What interests me a little bit is this. It's an unfortunate truth that the world keeps getting more expensive. Prices for food, materials, and transportation have been trending upwards for a few years now, and Warhammer isn't immune to that trend. Seems a little bit weird that you're mentioning food in relation to reasoning for the cost increase of plastic miniatures. I didn't know that they needed sustenance. Materials, obviously, I don't know the cost of plastic, so maybe the costs of plastic have gone up. And transportation, possibly with all of the hoo-ha in the Middle East, that may well have gone up for stuff going that way, unless they import the plastic from the Far East. I'm not entirely sure how transportation would at least affect the cost of things domestically. Especially when food inflation is at its lowest that it's been for about 2 years now. And one of the big cost drivers, I would imagine, for Games Workshop must be energy. Electricity, gas, for their offices, for their factory. I don't know if many people follow inflation in the UK. I would imagine not. And I do apologise in advance, because this video is going to contain a lot of numbers. Inflation for gas within the last 12 months is actually non-existent. It's deflation. The price has actually fallen by 27.1% within the last 12 months. If we look at electricity, we have deflation, where the price has actually fallen by 13%. Now, I do appreciate, in balance, these are wholesale costs and therefore more representative of a household's electricity and gas bills, which may well not be representative of the costs that Games Workshop would be facing as a business, but it would be logical to assume that if wholesale prices are falling, then the costs that they would be experiencing should also be falling. Now, while we can't look specifically at transportation, what we can look at is the cost of fuels. And the cost for petrol, diesel, and other fuel products is less. It's 4% down. So there's a lot of reasoning here as to why costs perhaps shouldn't be increasing. Moreover, if we go back to the pricing, we see that the cost increase for a squad of Necron warriors, which is the example that they give, is 4% for the US, 5% for the UK, and 2.5% for Europe, which seems bizarre. Now, you might be asking, why is that so bizarre? But most of the Warhammer 40k miniatures are produced in a factory in Nottingham, in the UK, and yet the percentage increase is at its highest for its domestic market, so it can't be transportation, because the transportation costs to its domestic market surely would be the least. Whereas anything which is being shipped as far away as America, the percentage increase is less. Or even to the Europe, or even to the continent, it's less still. Now, you would expect that the transportation costs from Nottingham to America would be more than the transportation costs of Nottingham to Paris, for instance. And that's because it would. There's no reason why Europe has the least cost increase and that the UK has the highest. Now, you could argue that it's down to wage growth, which may well be the case, because we did have a reasonable increase in the minimum wage within the UK. But their argument is that they need to do this, and that they've done their best to keep prices down. But the question is that true? Because from what we've already discussed, if anything, a lot of their costs should be decreasing, not increasing. And the only arguable cost that should be increasing would likely be perhaps rental or staffing. But there's a real possibility that the rate that certain costs are decreasing may well have a mitigating factor against the costs that are increasing. Because I would imagine that the energy bill for a store decreasing by, let's say, even 10% probably offsets the 2 members of staff that are in that store on their increase in wage. I would assume that that is a logical assessment to make. And yet, we're being told that these price increases are required. So, something doesn't quite add up. So what I thought we'd do is we'd actually have a little look at their figures. Especially as they are using inflation as the argument for their costs increasing. So just to explain the parameters of what we're going to look at today. These are all their half-year statements of the 6 months running up until the 29th of November. Now, you might ask, why am I not looking at their full year accounts? The reason for this is their most recent figure that they have produced is the half-year accounts running up to November 2023. So I thought, to compare apples with apples, we would look at the 6 months for the same period and then basically dissect that into looking at how their business is looking and whether or not they actually need to make this increase. Now, all of this information is readily available. You can go literally just do a Google search, which will take you to the investor side of Games Workshop. And you can look at, I think, all of their files going back to 2014, 2015. So that's all of their account statements. Now, for ease of running through these figures, I have taken the important figures that we are going to look at and put them onto a spreadsheet, which makes it a lot easier, at least in my opinion, to digest. Now, the one thing I have to specify, some of these figures will not look like figures that are in the account specifically. And the reason for that is the accounts include, in many instances, what they call royalties or licensing fees. And I have deliberately removed those from the figures. The reason being, I am specifically wanting to look at their retail business and the cost of miniatures. I have effectively looked at the last 6 years and an outlier year of 2015-2016. I could have gone potentially 10 years ago, but I chose not to because 10 years ago we were pretty much still reeling from another financial crash, which might not necessarily have shown things in a great light anyways. So what I chose was to look at 15-16, and then basically the most recent 6 years. So we can see how over the last sort of 7 to 8 years, their business has moved forward. It's fairly self-explanatory what I've done here. So we've got their gross revenue and their cost of sales. Now, when we talk about cost of sales, what we're talking about is effectively manufacturing costs. So their staffing, their factory, their materials, the heating, the electricity, all of that on the manufacturing side. So what it costs them annually to make the products that they are selling. As we can see in 15-16, it was 16,802,000. Now, to be fair, these figures are going to be up quite a bit. I will actually just zoom in as well. So if you want to have a look at it, you can. There, that'll do. Now, what I've called PCOS is percentage cost of sales. So what percentage of their revenue is actually taken up through manufacturing? Now, what we can see for the most part, it tends to be around about 30%. 30 to 31%. November 2022, 2023, for anyone who isn't in the UK, I mean, there was a cost of living crisis pretty much everywhere, but gas and electric was incredibly expensive. So the likelihood is that these costs are down to transportation, gas, electric, which is why they're a little bit higher as a percentage. But you can see that in the most recent 6-month accounts, they fell back down to about 30 to 31%. To put that into layman terms, what that means is that for a £30 pack of miniatures, approximately £9 to £9.30 of it is the actual cost of that miniature. Now this then leaves us with the gross profit figure. So in the latest accounts, the 6-month period up until November 2023, they made gross profit of £163.5 million. Now from that we have to look at operating expenses. Now operating expenses is basically their head office, their IT, their retail, so all of the stores and the costs that they incur. So that's heating, electricity, staffing, the full works. In the most recent 6-month accounts, that was 81.1 million. So not a small chunk of change by any stretch of the imagination. As you can see here, I've made a little note to be re-added. These figures only appear in the latest 2 years' accounts, and it's what they are attributing as a cost for the licensing agreements. So I have to add that back in because I'm not taking the income into consideration. Now this basically gives us an operating profit, which is massively increasing year on year. Basically records operating profit. This is the money that they take home of £83.4 million, not including licensing. If I remember rightly, the licensing profits for the most recent year were in approximately 11 million. So that's another 11 million that you could add on there. So that means that their operating profit, based on those figures, of their revenue of £235,600,000 is 35.4%, which I would argue is probably a tad bit excessive. So using this as justification that costs are going up to increase prices further, despite all of the price increases that we've had recently, seems like bullshit. There's no other way to put it. It's just crap. Now, if we look historically, back to 2015, 2016, the operating profit percentage was 8.5%. So they were still making profit, but they were not making anywhere near as much profit. And since then, we've had massive expansion of revenue, particularly overseas. But we've had, on average, a steady increase of the actual percentage of operating profit. 2021 seems to be a bit of a weird year where they were operating at an absolutely extortionate margin. And I guess the point that I'm getting at here is if you're making 35% of your gross revenue as profit, do you actually need to increase the costs? And the answer is no, they don't. They're making a very, very healthy profit for their investors as things stand. But they're doing it because they think they can get away with it. They want more profit. They want to push that percentage higher, would be my argument. And we can see that historically it definitely seems to track. Because the reality is, Games Workshop has never been more profitable than it is now. And yet, they want it to be more profitable at the expense of the consumer. It's always at the expense of the consumer because it's the consumer who is buying the bloody product. So when they bump these prices to pad their bottom line further, it's me and you that basically will incur these costs. One thing that I would like to draw attention to here is the argument or the it's not really an argument, it's more an inference that it is inflation increasing these prices, that prices go up because the price of everything is going up, which, as we've already stated, significant proportions of their business, the percentages of inflation are actually massively decreasing. If we were to look at the effect of inflation on the price of miniatures or miniature packs as time has progressed, we get a very different picture. Now, I know that there will be some people out there who turn around and say that using inflation or RPI or CPI as a basis for the price of things, particularly luxury items, which basically the hobby is a luxury item, it's not something that you need to survive, is not an accurate reflection. And they, largely speaking, would be correct. However, by the same token, the inflation that would actually affect these miniatures is not reflective of the inflation that would normally affect a household's costs. For instance, food inflation is not something that would affect miniatures. The rate of inflation, say, over the last 2 years, should actually be less of an effect on these products, because one of the biggest drivers of inflation, particularly within the UK, was the cost of food. So if they don't affect the cost of miniatures, then the rate of inflation that we should apply to miniatures should actually be less. At least that's my thoughts. Obviously, I might not be correct. I am just using my own little form of logic to make that deduction. Now, if we look at the cost of miniatures from 2012, obviously I'm not looking at everything. The main reason being is it's bloody hard to find accurate costs of things from 2012, seeing as they're no longer on sale, and no longer that cost. Now, if we look at tactical marines, a box of tactical marines in 2012 cost £23. If we implied inflation, including food inflation, fuel inflation, gas, electric inflation, all of that sort of stuff, then the inflationary cost should be £31.85 as of today. Games Workshop cost has outstripped that at £35 and will be increasing, following their logic, by at least £1 to £2. Interestingly, the cost of a Dreadnought in 2012 was £28. Using the same inflation, it should be £38.78, but is currently £37.50. Now, this is one of the few anomalies that I can actually find. Now, a Space Marine Captain was £14, is now £25, but if it was just inflation, it should be £19.39. And almost as shocking is the Land Raider, which in 2012 would have been £41, with inflation should be £56.78, and yet is £67.50. So you can see that the costs that Games Workshop is charging now for these products has outstripped inflation. And as the argument that I've put down, particularly with regards to inflation over the last 2 years, the inflation on their products would not be the same rate as the inflation that the average household has actually experienced. It is far more likely a lesser rate of inflation, including, as I've already stated, the fact that some of their core costs, energy and fuel, should actually be reducing as well over the last 12 months. So the increase that they are planning, as far as I'm concerned, can be for no other reason than profiteering, or at the very least, maintaining the level of profits that they currently have. Now, personally, I'm on a little bit of a Games Workshop boycott at the moment. Even if I wasn't, I wouldn't buy anything from a Games Workshop shop anyways, unless I absolutely had to get a pre-order. And the reason for that is there are many sites online where if you want to buy Pucker Games Workshop products, you can get them at a discount, usually up to 20%. Now, what I would argue is that anyone who wants to continue supporting Games Workshop, go to those sites. Save yourself some money at the very least for buying the product, particularly with the cost increases that are coming in, which as far as I'm concerned are needless. They are making a shed ton of money already. Because of their responsibility to ensure shareholders' profits, they are just, once again, resorting to screwing the customer. Now, I did rather flippantly, in my previous video, say that they would get back to either screwing the law or screwing the customer, and not necessarily in that order. And sadly, I was right. It was not in that order. But what I would ask is that people actually start to boycott Games Workshop, to change their pricing structure, to lower their prices. If people keep paying the increased prices and their profits keep going up, then they will continue to increase the prices because you will keep coming back. Likewise, if they change the law and you continue to buy the products and they become more and more profitable, they will use that as justification to continue doing what they're doing because it's growing their profits. If you want to send a message, you need to send a message. And the only way that they will listen is by hitting them in their wallet. So don't spend your money. If you do have to spend your money, spend it in the right way. Ensure that you are not supporting them as much as possible. Support independent retailers who will give you a discount and allow you to buy that product cheaper while ensuring that those independent retailers still exist in the future. But ideally, reduce what you buy pre-owned, if possible, buy nothing. Now, just as a little sort of interesting point I'd like to make here, while I was wading through this and their guff, there is a point which turns around and says that they have 169,000 subscribers to Warhammer Plus. If you are one of those subscribers out there and you feel like you need to continue buying the minis and you won't support an independent retailer, at the very least I would ask you to cancel that subscription. Warhammer Plus is one of the biggest piles of shit that has ever been launched. They money-walled content that prior to it was widely available for free. And if you want to try to hurt them financially without impacting your hobby, that is the first place where I would start. And I would just scrap that subscription, save yourself that little bit of money, and at least show them that this cannot continue. But with that, if you've liked the video, please give it a like. If you could subscribe, I would appreciate it. This is a growing channel, and every subscription, every like, even every comment is appreciated. I do try to respond to every comment that is made, but once again, that's it for me, so that's it for you.